The rain hammered against the classroom windows with relentless fury, each droplet a tiny fist demanding attention. Olivia Keller stood at the blackboard, her weathered hands gripping a piece of chalk that had worn down to a stub, much like herself. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her lined face, highlighting the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones after 37 years of teaching. Her cardigan, once a vibrant blue, had faded to the color of forgotten dreams. Behind her empty desks bore the ghost marks of absent students who had already mentally checked out for winter break. The new principal's words from that morning still echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain, too sentimental to be effective. She had suggested a simple coat drive for the homeless population that had been growing near Lincoln Elementary in downtown UA, Chicago. The response had been swift and sharp, laughter from younger colleagues who tapped their smartphones and checked their smartwatches while dismissing her as a relic from a gentler time. Olivia had smiled politely, as she always did, even when the words cut deeper than any knife ever could. At 58, Olivia felt like a museum piece that no one quite had the courage to discard. Her teaching methods, once praised as innovative, were now labeled outdated. Her genuine concern for students' emotional well-being was dismissed as weakness. Even her own family had begun to drift away like autumn leaves caught in an unforgiving wind. The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows and matching the storm brewing in Olivia's weary heart. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, knowing that once again she would walk home alone to an empty apartment where only silence waited to greet her. The loneliness had become so profound that she sometimes spoke aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. As Olivia packed her worn leather satchel, she caught her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back looked tired, forgotten, invisible. She wondered when she had become this ghost of herself, when her passion for teaching had been slowly suffocated by indifference and dismissal. The rain continued its assault, each drop a reminder that storms don't ask permission before they arrive. Walking through the empty hallways, her footsteps echoed with a hollow sound that seemed to mock her solitude. Tomorrow would bring another day of feeling overlooked, another day of watching younger teachers receive opportunities that once would have been hers. But tonight, Olivia Keller simply wanted to disappear into the grey December evening, carrying her invisible wounds like stones in her chest. The schoolyard stretched before her, a desolate expanse of cracked asphalt and chain-link fencing. It was there, hunched against the back wall like a forgotten prayer, that she first saw him. A man in a frayed coat that had seen better decades, sitting motionless in the cold drizzle. His stillness was profound, not the restless fidgeting of someone waiting for a bus, but the deep quiet of someone who had learned to make himself invisible to a world that no longer saw him. Olivia paused at the gate keys jingling in her cold fingers. Something about his posture struck her, the way his shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to fold himself out of existence. His head was bowed, not in sleep, but in resignation. She recognized that pose. She had worn it herself many times recently. For 3 days she observed him from behind the safety of routine. Each morning he would appear like a shadow against the brick wall, and each evening he would still be there. When she left, he never approached the fence, never called out or made demands. He simply existed in that small space as if he had found the only corner of the world that would tolerate his presence. On the 4th morning, Olivia stood in her tiny kitchen, staring at the sandwich she had made for lunch. Turkey and mustard on soft bread, nothing fancy but made with care. Her hands moved almost without conscious thought, wrapping it in wax paper, with the same attention she had once given to packing her daughter's school lunches decades ago. Before Sarah had grown up and grown distant, before the harsh words and disappointed silences had built walls between them. The walk to school felt different that morning, purposeful in a way that had been missing from her life for too long. Olivia placed the wrapped sandwich on the bench near the fence, not looking toward the wall where the man sat. She didn't want to make it about pity or charity. Somehow she understood that dignity was as important as sustenance. When she returned that afternoon, the sandwich was gone. No note, no acknowledgement, just an empty bench, and the faint impression that something meaningful had occurred. That night Olivia slept better than she had in months, though she couldn't quite explain why. The ritual began quietly, like most beautiful things do. Each morning brought a small offering, a piece of fruit wrapped in a napkin, a thermos of hot, tea that steamed in the cold air, sometimes a handwritten note with a poem or quote that had touched her heart. Even in winter, the earth remembers spring. She wrote one day, the words flowing from a place of hope she had thought long dead. Never once did she see him take the offerings. It was as if a benevolent spirit visited the bench each day, accepting her gifts and leaving nothing but gratitude hanging in the air like morning mist. Olivia found herself looking forward to these moments of giving, these small acts that made her feel useful again. But one morning she arrived to find her offering untouched. The apple she had polished to a shine sat exactly where she had left it, as if the world had suddenly stopped turning. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had something happened to him? Was he ill? Had he moved on? The next day brought the same cruel disappointment, and the day after that. Her carefully prepared gifts remained unclaimed monuments to a connection that might have been nothing more than her imagination. The shame that washed over Olivia was surprising in its intensity. She had allowed herself to believe that these small exchanges mattered, that she was making a difference in someone's life. Now faced with the evidence of her own foolishness, she felt more invisible than ever. Even a homeless man, it seemed, had no use for what she had to offer. Olivia's daughter, Sarah, had stopped calling months ago after their last terrible argument about money and responsibility. "You never supported me anyway," Sarah had said, her voice sharp with decades of accumulated resentment. The words had landed like physical blows, partly because they carried just enough truth to sting. Olivia had always tried to teach Sarah to be self-reliant, perhaps too much so. Now self-reliance felt more like abandonment. Her grandson Tommy, once the light of her world, had become a stranger, who communicated only in abbreviated text messages. K. The X. The child who used to beg for bedtime stories now seemed to barely tolerate her existence. Olivia kept his photo, on her refrigerator anyway, clinging to memories of better times when her love had been wanted and returned. The loneliness had become a living thing, growing larger each day, feeding on silence and disappointment. Olivia found herself talking to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, having full conversations with the tired woman who stared back at her. Sometimes she would set 2 place settings at dinner just to remember what it felt like to expect company. At school, the isolation was just as profound. The younger teachers had formed their own circle, communicating through group chats and social media platforms that Olivia barely understood. They spoke in abbreviated phrases and made references to shows she had never seen, cultural touchstones from a world that had moved on without her. When they organized their holiday dinner, she wasn't invited. "We thought you'd be tired," one of them had said without meeting her eyes. The weight of invisibility pressed down on Olivia like a heavy blanket, making each day harder to navigate than the last. She wondered if this was how it would always be now, watching life happen from the sidelines, irrelevant and forgotten. The man by the fence had at least accepted her offerings for a while. Now even that small connection had vanished, leaving her more alone than ever. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, official and ominous among the usual collection of bills and advertisements. Olivia's hands shook as she tore it open, the legal language swimming before her eyes like incomprehensible poetry. Subpoena, court hearing, trespassing. The name Eduardo Morales meant nothing to her, but somehow she knew, with the certainty that comes from deep in the bones, that this was about the man by the fence. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Had someone seen her leaving food? Was she in trouble for feeding him? Had her small acts of kindness somehow made things worse for both of them? The paper trembled in her grasp as she read it again, searching for clues in the formal language that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform. Sleep became impossible. Olivia lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of their wordless interaction. She had never even spoken to Eduardo, if that was indeed his name, and yet somehow their lives had become entangled in the eyes of the law. The irony wasn't lost on her, that her first meaningful connection with another human being in months might now be dissected in a courtroom. The morning of the hearing arrived grey and cold, matching Olivia's mood perfectly. She dressed carefully, in her best coat, the navy blue one she saved for parent conferences and funerals, and tried to calm her racing heart. The courthouse loomed before her like a monument to judgment, its stone steps worn smooth by countless others who had climbed them, carrying their own burdens of guilt and hope. Inside, the hallways echoed with hushed conversations and the shuffle of nervous feet. Olivia sat on a hard wooden bench surrounded by strangers, living through their own legal dramas. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling, and she clasped them tightly in her lap to hide their betrayal of her fear. She felt ridiculous in her formal clothes, like an imposter playing dress-up in a world where she didn't belong. When Eduardo entered the courtroom, Olivia gasped audibly. Gone was the hunched figure in the frayed coat. This man stood straight, his hair neatly cut, his eyes clear and alert. He wore clothes that fit properly, and carried himself with a dignity that took her breath away. When his gaze found hers across the room, he nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed volumes. In that moment, Olivia felt seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The transformation was so complete that she wondered if she had imagined their connection entirely. How could this composed, well-groomed man be the same person who had sat against that wall day after day, invisible to everyone but her? Yet something in his eyes confirmed what her heart already knew. This was Eduardo, and somehow their paths had led them both to this moment of reckoning. The prosecutor's words fell like hammer blows on Olivia's heart. Nuisance, danger, risk to minors. Each accusation painted Eduardo as a threat, a problem to be solved, rather than a human being in need of compassion. She watched him sit quietly as his character was dissected and dismissed his struggles reduced to legal jargon that stripped away all humanity. Olivia's stomach churned as she listened to the clinical description of loitering and trespassing charges that transformed Eduardo's survival into criminal activity. The image they painted bore no resemblance to the quiet man who had accepted her offerings with such dignity, who had somehow understood that their wordless exchange was about more than food. It was about seeing and being seen. When the judge asked if the defendant wished to speak, the courtroom fell silent. Eduardo rose slowly, his movements deliberate and respectful. Olivia held her breath, not knowing what to expect, but feeling that everything hung in the balance of whatever words might come next. "I trespassed," Eduardo said, his voice soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "Not to harm, but to survive, because someone fed me." He turned and pointed directly at Olivia, and she felt her heart stop. Every eye in the room followed his gesture, pinning her to her seat like a butterfly in a display case. The attention was overwhelming, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in months, she mattered to someone. "She gave me food," Eduardo continued, his words measured and profound. "Not because she pitied me, but because she saw me." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Olivia could feel the shift in energy, the way Eduardo's simple statement had changed the entire atmosphere of the proceedings. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending her, honoring what had passed between them. "She fed me through a fence, quietly, like someone who knows what it means to be invisible." Eduardo paused, and in that silence, Olivia felt her world shifting on its axis. "I never said thank you, I was ashamed." Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't look away from this man who was speaking truths she had never dared voice herself. He understood. Somehow in their wordless exchanges he had seen not just her kindness, but her pain, her own hunger for connection and meaning. Eduardo turned back to the judge, his posture straight and dignified. "She didn't do it for praise. I think she did it because maybe no one feeds her anymore either. Not with food, but with kindness." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. In a few simple sentences, Eduardo had laid bare the truth she had been hiding, even from herself. She wasn't just feeding him. She was feeding her own starving soul, finding purpose in the act of caring for another human being. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, washing away months of accumulated pain and loneliness. The judge sat in contemplative silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only moments. When he finally leaned forward, his voice carried a weight that filled the entire courtroom. "Case dismissed." The gavel's bang seemed to echo forever. Eduardo walked out free, his back straight and his head high. Olivia remained frozen in her seat, unable to process what had just happened. Defending himself, Eduardo had somehow defended her, too validating every small act of kindness she had offered, and revealing their true worth. Outside the courthouse, the winter air felt different, cleaner, somehow full of possibility, rather than punishment. Olivia stood on the steps, still processing the morning's events, when Eduardo approached her. Up close, she could see that his transformation was real but recent. His clothes were clean but worn, his shoes resoled but cared for. This was a man rebuilding his life, one careful step at a time. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes meeting hers directly. Not for needing help, but for never saying, "Thank you." Olivia looked into those eyes and saw her own reflection. Not the tired, invisible woman she had become accustomed to seeing, but someone worthy of gratitude and respect. "I needed you too," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop. Them. It was true. In giving to him, she had found something she didn't even know she was looking for: purpose, connection, the knowledge that she still mattered in this world. Eduardo had given her that gift simply by accepting what she offered, by allowing her to feel useful again. In the days that followed, Olivia found small gifts waiting for her at the school fence. A single flower picked from some hidden garden and offered with the same quiet dignity with which he had once accepted her sandwiches. A folded paper with a poem written in careful handwriting, the words chosen with the precision of someone who understood their power. Nothing expensive, but everything meaningful. The principal never knew about these exchanges, but Olivia carried their significance like a secret flame, warming her from within. She had learned something profound about the nature of kindness, that it flows both ways, creating connections that transcend circumstances and status. Every small gift reminded her that she was not invisible, that her actions had consequences, beyond what she could see. One morning, Eduardo appeared at the school gate, not as a shadow seeking shelter, but as a man with news to share. He had found work at a small library downtown, shelving books and helping patrons find what they were looking for. The irony wasn't lost on Olivia. Eduardo, who had once been overlooked and dismissed, was now helping others locate the things they needed. He brought her a card that morning, handmade and carefully crafted. Inside, in his neat handwriting, were words that would stay with Olivia forever. "Miss Keller, you saved me, and I think maybe I helped you remember you're still alive." Olivia excused herself to the staff bathroom and cried for 15 minutes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. She wasn't just a tired, outdated teacher, after all. She was a human being capable of making a difference, worthy of recognition and respect. Eduardo's words had given her back her sense of self, her understanding of her own value in the world. Have you ever experienced being invisible in your own life? Or do you know someone who has felt forgotten and overlooked by the world around them? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Eduardo continued to visit occasionally, always bringing something small but significant. A sketch he had drawn during his lunch break, a flower from the library's small garden, or simply a smile that reminded Olivia of her own worth. These moments became treasures that she carried with her through the more difficult days, proof that kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond the initial act. The younger teachers at school still didn't invite Olivia to their gatherings, and the principal still dismissed her suggestions with condescending smiles. But something fundamental had changed within her. She no longer needed their approval to know her worth. The quiet validation from Eduardo had rekindled something that she thought had been permanently extinguished: her belief in herself and the value of compassion. Olivia began to see the world differently, noticing other invisible people who moved through their days unacknowledged and unseen. The custodian who worked late cleaning classrooms received homemade cookies from her kitchen. The crossing guard who stood in all weather got a thermos of hot coffee on cold mornings. Small acts of recognition that cost her nothing but meant everything to their recipients. The change in Olivia didn't go completely unnoticed. Some of her students began staying after class to ask questions they had never voiced before, sensing something warmer and more approachable in their teacher. Parents mentioned in conferences how much their children enjoyed her class, how they came home talking about lessons that felt more engaging than before. Olivia realized that by feeding her own soul, she had more to give to others. But the most profound change was the one that occurred within her own heart. The crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion began to lift, replaced by a sense of connection to something larger than herself. She had learned that being seen and valued didn't require grand gestures or widespread recognition. Sometimes it only took one person understanding the true worth of your actions. As winter gave way to spring, Olivia kept a small framed photo on the counter beside her kettle, a picture from the courthouse steps that Eduardo had asked a passerby to take of them together. In it, she could see something in her own face that had been missing for too long. Hope. It served as a daily reminder that even when the world tries to convince you that you're useless, a single act of human kindness can change everything. The story of the teacher and the homeless man became something of a legend in their small corner of Chicago, passed along in whispered conversations and knowing glances. But for Olivia, it was never about becoming a legend. It was about remembering that every person carries something valuable to offer, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happen when two invisible people decide to see each other. Years later, when Olivia finally retired from teaching, Eduardo spoke at her farewell celebration. He told the assembled crowd about the morning when a teacher's simple sandwich had saved his life, and how her kindness had taught him that dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you recognize in yourself and others. The audience sat in stunned silence as he explained how Olivia's gifts had fed more than his body. They had nourished his belief that he was worth saving. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was what Olivia said in response. Standing before colleagues who had once dismissed her as too sentimental, she spoke with quiet confidence about the power of small acts performed with great love. She talked about how Eduardo had saved her too, not through grand gestures, but by allowing her to remember that she was still alive, still capable of making a difference. The room fell silent as Olivia concluded with words that would be remembered long after that day. They tried to make me feel useless. But a sandwich, a note, a moment of human dignity stopped a judge cold. Because even when forgotten, a heart like mine still matters. In that moment, surrounded by people who finally understood her worth, Olivia knew that her most important lesson had never been written on a blackboard. It had been lived out in the simple act of feeding a stranger, proving that kindness is never wasted, and that every person, no matter how invisible they may feel, has the power to transform another's life. The story of Olivia and Eduardo spread beyond that school, beyond that courthouse, beyond that small corner of Chicago where two forgotten people found each other. It became a reminder that in a world increasingly focused on achievement and recognition, the most meaningful victories often happen quietly, one act of compassion at a time. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.